This may be part of a tit-for-tat strike from Russia on Ukraine in response to Ukrainian strikes on Russia. There was a Ukrainian drone that struck a Russian beachfront, killing some civilians. And so to the extent that there have been some tit-for-tat small exchanges like this, that seems to fit that pattern for now.
Well, that is the sound of a video showing a Russian drone attempting to kill a Ukrainian market vendor in what's being described as a human safari. The pictures show a 52-year-old man being chased around a van that had been used to sell fruit and vegetables, and the drone does eventually detonate nearby. The man apparently escaped with multiple shrapnel wounds, concussion and trauma. Kyiv has accused Moscow of a war crime. President Zelensky, who released that video, said the world should see every piece of evidence that Russia has gone mad. Well, let's talk to William Courtney, Adjunct Senior Fellow at RAND and a former US ambassador. Good evening to you, William.
Hello, Carole.
We know and have heard for quite some time about the way that drone warfare has transformed the way that the conflict is being played out on both sides. This footage that has been released by President Zelensky, what do you make of it?
Well, Russia from the beginning has been purposely attacking civilian targets. It sends drones and missiles against apartment blocks throughout Ukraine. There has been no distinction in the way Russia attacks, whether it's military or civilian targets. Attacking purely civilian targets is a war crime. And this is something that Ukraine, for its part, has carefully avoided. It attacks military and military supporting targets in Russia, but does not purposely attack civilian targets. So this is correct. President Zelensky is correct. This really is a war crime.
But, I mean, people listening to this may well remember that just in the last couple of days, we saw that Ukrainian drone which landed on a beach in Russia, killing civilians. And we have, of course, seen Ukrainian attacks on things like these warehouses across Russia.
The warehouses are part of an intricate supply chain system. They supply goods that both military and civilian customers acquire. So there can be an argument that they are war-supporting economic activities. But that argument will have to be carefully assessed. The Ukrainians have not attacked purposely civilian targets, so we'll have to wait and see what investigation shows about that explosion on the beach, whether that's a Ukrainian drone or some other drone. But this would be out of character for Ukraine to attack a civilian.
Yeah, I mean, there were two warehouses from this Wildberries chain. The company is described as the Russian Amazon, that's been hit repeatedly. And in strikes overnight, there was another site linked to Wildberry that was hit, and at least 5 people were killed and 10 more injured at an industrial site south of the Kremlin. So, I mean, there have been civilian casualties in Russia as well as in Ukraine, haven't there, William?
There's a vast difference between the two. So Russia is purposely attacking civilian targets and killing larger numbers of people. There is collateral damage. Civilians are being killed, evidently, in these Wildberries attacks, but relatively quite small numbers. And so when you assess a war crime, you have to assess to what extent is that collateral damage sufficient to be something beyond a relatively small consideration or consideration that does not make it a war crime.
I mean, we have seen increasingly, haven't we, Ukraine taking the fight to Russia, using those longer range missiles to make sure that the Russian people are reminded that the war is not just along the Ukrainian front line, and that has been seen as something that has, to a degree, turned the tide in this war. Do you think that is right?
I wouldn't say turn the tide. Now, when people talk about turn the tide, they're really talking about the battlefield. And on the battlefield, Russia has really stalled and has been unable to gain significant territory, and has gained small amounts of territory at extraordinary human and material cost. What is going on with the attacks on oil refineries, for example, is an attack on an industry whose product is vital for the Russian warfighters. So this arguably is a war-supporting industry.
I mean, when you see that video of the way this drone is pursuing someone who is believed to be a market trader in southern Ukraine, it is chilling stuff, isn't it? And we've had a warning, haven't we, from Kyiv's ambassador to the UK that NATO is a decade behind Russia on the battlefield, particularly when it comes to these new technologies.
But was certainly attacking and taunting and then attacking the vegetable seller really is shocking. This is the kind of behavior, though, that Russia has consistently carried out against Ukraine. With regard to the battlefield, NATO is indeed learning, U.S. forces are indeed learning from the fighting in Ukraine, because the advent of drones, large-scale fights with drones, hundreds of thousands of them in short periods of time being used. This is something new in warfare, so it is quite true that NATO is learning. But NATO has other capabilities as well that are important for Ukraine. So there are, if you will, some areas where NATO is ahead, and also some areas where NATO is behind.
We're hearing some reports suggesting there are further attacks being carried out on Kyiv tonight, as so many other nights. We have heard, haven't we, about the prospect of renewed US attempts to try to broker steps towards peace or even a ceasefire in the war in Ukraine. Suggestions that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, both of whom have been to Moscow quite a few times, might actually go to Kyiv and meet President Zelensky. Do you think there are serious attempts to try to get some sort of peace process underway by the Americans?
Not through that mechanism. The United States, Mr. Witkoff, Mr. Kushner, have had numerous meetings with President Putin, but no productive negotiations seem to have emerged from that. Of course, they've not visited Ukraine yet, so this would be a new thing. But what's important to remember is that it is the Europeans that are providing the vast amount of assistance to Ukraine after President Trump cut off financial and military assistance to Ukraine. The U.S. is selling weapons to Europeans who provide them to Ukraine. But the real negotiating leverage now comes from Europeans and Ukrainians working together. There's a trust relationship between Europe and Ukraine now, which is vital for any negotiation. So the United States, by ceasing its assistance to Ukraine, has diminished its ability to help negotiate a solution.
William Courtney, Adjunct Senior Fellow at RAND and a former US Ambassador. Really good to get your insight. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're quite welcome, Carole.
Kyiv has accused Moscow of war crimes after a Russian drone was filmed stalking a man in the Ukrainian city of Kherson before exploding, resulting in concussion and shrapnel injuries. 5 people have also been killed in Moscow after Ukrainian drones struck 2 warehouses owned by Russian online giant Wildberries. Known as Russia's Amazon, it accounts for 50% of online retail in the country, making it even more dominant in Russia than Amazon is in the United States. And there have been a succession of incidents where Ukraine has targeted wild berries and its warehouses. So this follows a pattern. Let's speak to Charles Hecker, who is an author and Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI. Good to have you with us, Charles.
Good evening, Kate.
Let's just touch on that quite alarming bit at the beginning of that queue, where a poor chap, a market vendor in Kherson, was quite literally, and you can go to the Times website and see this, by the way, if you're listening. He was he had his van out with his umbrella, selling his goods, and this drone appears to be targeting him specifically, following him around, which would be a war crime, of course. Is there an explanation for this?
There isn't yet, except that this may be part of a tit-for-tat strike from Russia on Ukraine in response to Ukrainian strikes on Russia. There was a Ukrainian drone that struck a Russian beachfront, killing some civilians. And so to the extent that there have been some tit-for-tat small exchanges like this, that seems to fit that pattern for now.
Yeah, it looks pretty worrying and pretty scary, though, I have to say. Let's move on to wild berries, because we're still trying to establish some of the details concerning that Ukrainian market vendor. This is a pattern of attack now from Ukraine. And there have been lots of conversations about actually, if Amazon was struck here in this country and we were at war and we weren't really that clued up about it, or it had been, obscured from our view, that might bring it to our attention if we suddenly lost Amazon.
Well, that's right. I mean, this is I shouldn't say that this is a huge change in strategy on behalf of the way Ukraine is targeting Russia. This is part of an ongoing escalation and intensification, and also a penetration of Russian airspace by Ukrainian drones. This feels different because, as you accurately point out, Kate, they have targeted a brand that is consumer-facing. And this is a website and a platform that the average Russian buys goods and services from, and that lots of Russian small businesses, medium businesses, and entrepreneurs place their goods and services on as a marketplace for sale. So this will strike at a part of Russian consumer society that so far has been left untouched by the war.
Is it going to make a difference?
Well, I mean, I think we have is the quick answer, to be honest with you. I mean, I think we have to remember that when it comes to the Russian public and the Russian consumer, they have seen double-digit inflation, double-digit interest rates, periodic disconnection of the mobile internet. They've had to queue for hours to get petrol in recent days. And so this is really just a tiny uptick, really, if you're thinking about escalation and a change for the Russian consumer. This isn't necessarily a sea change in the way the war is working. It feels differently because wild berries is such a prominent consumer brand.
Catherine Phillips, the diplomatic editor of The Times, has written a piece about this, and she, in it, mentions the Kremlin-allied oligarch Oleg Deripaska. He's warned that wild berries' downfall, if that's what happens, could bring about the collapse of a cascade of Russian banks with disastrous implications for Russia's structurally exhausted economy. Is that right?
There's absolutely no question that the Russian economy is under crushing pressure as a result of sanctions, as a result of funding the war, and actual, the length of the war itself. The Russian economy is not close to collapse. The Russian banking system has done a lot to have to finance the war and is being leaned on by the Kremlin to cough up cash to serve the military industry. But the economy continues to chug on. It continues to prove to be resilient. The banking system will also continue to push forward. So, I just don't see the symptoms of collapse yet.
Russians are already squeezed in a really extreme rate, double-digit interest rates, as you say, double-digit in inflation, that this will sort of be water off a duck's back. Why is Ukraine able to target wild berries? There is another motivation here for them, isn't there?
That's right. Well, what Ukraine is saying is that wild berries is being used to supply the Russian military with technical components.
Is that true?
Well, we'll never know because these.
Someone needs to jump onto wild berries and try and buy a helmet and a missile.
See if we can order targeting devices on wild berries and have them delivered to our postbox. We will not know whether wild berries is being used to ship dual-use technology or components from China or from anywhere else in the world to supply the Russian military. If that's happening, I'm sure it is extremely well disguised, as most of the Russian military supply chain is. But this is one of the ways that Ukraine is legitimizing its attacks on wild berries, which again sort of feel like a civilian target. Ukraine is saying that this is not the case.
Catherine Phillips saying that Wildberries swiftly took down a promotional page entitled "Everything for the Special Military Operation." The catalogue advertised everything from body armour and tactical helmets to equipment for allowing civilian drones to carry projectile grenades. There we are. Look, it is an interesting pattern of assault for Ukraine, and it shows just how sophisticated they are now when it comes to targeting long range inside Russia. And it seems like a good point to leave it there. We're out of time, but thank you so much for coming in. It's really good to see you. Charles Hecker, author and Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI. Good to have you with us. Thank you.